750. That's the tragic number of farmers who actually lost their lives out in the bitter cold during that 2020 to 2021 winter of discontent right at the borders of New Delhi. It's a staggering human toll, isn't it? One that immediately commands our attention and really begs the vital question, why?
When you look at the geography of that standoff, it was just massive. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people occupying the capital's borders, specifically those massive protest encampments you might remember at Singhu, Tikri, and Ghazipur. And this was a resolutely non-violent mobilization that lasted well over a year. But to truly understand the systemic forces that pushed India's farmers to this absolute breaking point, well, we have to look much deeper than just a single protest.
So welcome to this explainer on the Indian agrarian crisis and the historic resistance. I'll be walking you through a forensic breakdown of a 30-year macroeconomic shift that ultimately ignited a revolution in the countryside. We're going to go straight to the data and the sources today to really uncover the roots of this crisis.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the roots of the agrarian crisis, visualize the peasant squeeze, break down those 2020 farm laws, dissect the anatomy of the resistance, and finally look at the unfinished agrarian agenda. And to understand those explosive 2020 protests, we actually need to rewind the clock all the way back to 1991.
Section 1. The Roots of the Agrarian Crisis, the Macro Shift of 1991. To grasp the real foundation of this crisis, we've got to contrast two very different eras. So before 1991, India operated under what's known as a dirgist regime. That meant state-led support, the Green Revolution, and vital protections like minimum support prices. But post-1991, the country shifted gears into a neoliberal regime, marked by aggressive state withdrawal and a pretty heavy reliance on unbridled market forces to dictate outcomes.
And the sheer scale of the government's financial pullback during this new era is just staggering. India experienced severe fiscal compression. To put that in perspective, robust public capital formation stood at over 15% back in 1980, but it plummeted to a mere 6.91% by the year 2000. Essentially, the state shifted away from direct production support, which left farmers incredibly exposed to some highly volatile domestic and international markets.
Zooming out for a second, this exposure is part of a much starker global imbalance. Under global neoliberalism, the global north and China are heavily subsidized. I mean, China alone provided $212 billion in agricultural subsidies in 2016. Meanwhile, the vulnerable global south absorbs the devastating shock of unprotected market exposure. It essentially leaves the peasantry completely at the mercy of spontaneous capitalism.
Section 2. Visualizing the peasant squeeze, a multidimensional crisis.
Now, this macroeconomic shift created what our sources called the peasant squeeze. Think of it like being in a vice. The Indian peasantry found themselves physically crushed between two massive forces. From above, you have the crushing weight of fiscal compression, so declining public expenditure and weakening protections. And from below, unregulated market exposure, rising input costs, volatile global prices, and corporate encroachment. And all of this leads directly to a forced semi-proletarianization of the farmers.
To truly understand the severe human impact of that squeeze, consider this. Back in the 1980s, a farmer's income was about 34% of a non-agricultural worker's income. But by 2016, that had collapsed to just 20%.
And simultaneously, as those incomes shrank, debts absolutely exploded. The average yearly debt for agricultural households surged by 57% between just 2013 and 2019 alone. So farmers were making far less from cultivation, but being forced to borrow significantly more just to survive.
Yet, despite this massive, crippling debt crisis, state support really didn't step in to fill the gap. Agricultural expenditure by the government has basically stagnated at an abysmal 0.3 to 0.5% of the national GDP over the last decade.
And the most chilling manifestation of this squeeze is the tragic human toll. 400,000. That is the number of farmers who have tragically taken their own lives since the late 1990s as a direct result of these unbearable pressures. It's a truly multidimensional crisis of income, debt, and basic human survival.
Section 3. The 2020 Farm Laws, the catalyst for standoff.
So the peasantry was already in deep, deep distress. And then came the ultimate catalyst. Now, maintaining absolute neutrality here, let's break down the 2020 legislation that sparked the protests based on the sources. Take the law on trade and commerce, for example. The government claimed it created a barrier-free, efficient market. But farmers? They apprehended this would completely destroy the minimum support price regime and allow corporate cartels to essentially dictate terms. Where the government saw price assurance through modern contracts, farmers saw a vast asymmetry in economic power that would just lead to corporate impunity.
At its absolute core, this was a massive clash of ideological paradigms. On one side, you have the state pushing for laissez-faire capitalism, viewing those old regulations as inefficient relics and pushing hard for market-driven dynamism. On the flip side, the peasantry was pushing for regulated capitalism. They asserted that in a highly unequal society, free markets just end up facilitating predatory corporate monopolies and that state regulation is absolutely essential to their very survival.
This existential threat was felt most acutely in the Green Revolution granaries of Punjab and Haryana. You see, these states had historically achieved assured income growth through that old regulated minimum support price shield. In fact, up to 95% of marginal and small farmers there successfully utilized MSPs. So the idea of dismantling this regime, it posed an immediate existential risk to their livelihoods.
Section 4. Anatomy of Historic Resistance, a Unified Front.
Tracing the rapid escalation, we can see exactly how things unfolded in 2020. In June, the government opportunistically used the cover of the COVID-19 pandemic to pass 3 major agricultural ordinances. By September, these received rushed parliamentary approval, largely bypassing traditional scrutiny. In response, by November 2020, spurred by immense disquiet, a united front of farmers began a historic march on New Delhi to oppose what they called the Black Laws.
This unification was, quite frankly, a masterclass in political progress. Fragmented, historical protests from states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Maharashtra consolidated first into the AIKSCC, uniting over 130 diverse organizations. Eventually, it grew into a massive coalition, the Samyak Kisan Morcha, or SKM. Think about this. Over 250 fragmented farmer organizations managed to overcome deep-rooted social contradictions, bridging long-standing caste, class, and gender divides to form one united front against a common threat.
Section 5. The Unfinished Agrarian Agenda, Beyond Repeal.
Now, while the incredible resilience of the farmers forced the government to ultimately repeal the 3 laws, the structural war is far from over. The fundamental crisis, it still remains. The movement continues to fight today for an unfinished agenda. They want statutory MSB assurance as a legal entitlement, comprehensive public sector insurance, a monthly Social Security pension of 10,000 rupees for older farmers, and critically, debt and input relief.
I want to highlight this incredibly powerful insight directly from our sources, which perfectly encapsulates the defining political economy challenge of contemporary India. No country that cares for its farmers abandons agriculture entirely to the logic of unbridled market forces. The protests absolutely proved that a resilient society requires a regulated approach that centers the peasantry.
So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative question about the future of our global food systems. As global capital expands, how will the developing world resolve the survival of its peasantry against unbridled market forces? Because at the end of the day, the standoff over the agrarian path forward doesn't just affect India, it affects all of us. Thank you for joining me for this breakdown.